The cameraman gets annoyed at me because I'm moving too much, just tell me. And I've got this great new presenter thing that I'm trying out, and we'll see if it actually works. Wake up, wake up. I know the little red dot worked. My cats will love that. Well, I guess I'll do it the old-fashioned manual way. I'm hoping that during this talk, you're going to learn more than one weird trick that will help you to be a better jQuery developer and actually to be a better developer in general. There's a lot of things that have happened to jQuery. I mean, when you think about it, jQuery was introduced in early 2006, so it's been around quite a while as far as the web goes. First, I want to tell you a little bit about the jQuery Foundation, because everybody pretty much knows jQuery. jQuery Core, jQuery UI, and mobile. And they understand that, or they probably know that the jQuery Foundation is the foundation, a nonprofit, that's responsible for managing and making sure that that code is code that will make you as web developers happier in your jobs. But we also try to make you happy in many other ways. And in particular, we represent you as web developers in the standards organizations, so that when standards are built, they represent the needs of real-life developers and not something that an agenda that a browser maker wanted to push. And we also try to encourage collaboration in open source projects. As you know, we're all kind of geeky, sometimes not as socially interactive as we should be as developers. And so people tend to say, oh, you know, I'd rather kind of build it myself, and they work in their own little world. And occasionally something breaks out and becomes incredibly popular, like jQuery or Bootstrap. But often we just end up having a lot of really good talent wasted in a way that we have 15 of the same thing. You see that a lot of times with jQuery plugins. I mean, how many jQuery Lightbox plugins do we really need? But what our main push is to really do more than just maintain the code. We want to help make sure that standards do what you want. Because we all know, you know, for example, CSS is awesome. The crazy thing is, of course, you know, there is an easy way to solve that. Anybody know how to solve that with use old technologies? Tables, right? Because tables will wrap around everything and they won't let things break out of the box. And of course, you know, and we all know that tables are bad, so we had to create grids and Flexbox to kind of allow us to say that tables were still bad. jQuery, the code itself, is incredibly well used. You can see that of the top 10,000 websites, 78% of them are using jQuery. And it's been pretty constant to slightly growing even over the past year. And the jQuery ecosystem, as I said, it involves much more than just jQuery itself. It includes the documentation, which the foundation maintains. It includes the developer expertise, the things that you guys have done over the years, the information that you've been able to pick up and transfer to other people when people come to conferences who aren't in the jQuery Foundation and they share their knowledge. There's third-party plugins, the 100 best third-party plugins of 2014. You know, there's always, every year there seem to be hundreds of plugins made. And jQuery is also the underpinning of just about every higher-level framework technology that's out there. You know, you try to focus your efforts as you build bigger things on bigger picture issues. But jQuery is still there, providing a lot of the same DOM library things that are needed in those situations. So, as I said, jQuery was created in 2006. In 2006, if you were in web development at the time, you think back to what was being done at the time, very little in the way of single-page apps. Most of what was being done with JavaScript was just enhancing a page. So it was validating forms. It was, you know, doing small animations, but it wasn't anything like trying to build something that would be competitive to a real app. And as a result, we've changed a lot about, we as web developers have changed a lot about the way we write code, and that includes writing jQuery. The performance bottlenecks that you see when you do that also differ, so that things that you might have done in 2006 without a second thought become liabilities as you try to write code in 2014. So the key here is that you as web developers want to evolve and write your code differently to make sure that you make the most out of the platform as it is today. And I know that some of you probably get the feeling that at times, jQuery is this angel that is hitting you with your own hands. We try not to do that. And I always feel like it's probably really more like this, that you think you know what jQuery is going to do, and you tell it to do something, but it turns out what you think is not what really happens. One of the questions that some people ask about when I tell them about things they should just avoid in jQuery is, why don't you just fix it? Why don't you just take it out? Why is it that you leave these foot guns in place that can hurt me? And the problem there is backwards compatibility. So we fixed some of these problems in jQuery 1.9 and 2.0. We actually removed features from the library because we felt like they were such bad practices that we just didn't want to be a part of those practices anymore. And we provided a way that if you have old code but you still wanted to upgrade jQuery, that there was a jQuery Migrate plugin that allowed you to do that. But the rest of it's kind of up to you. There are things that you can use responsibly, but you can abuse and cause problems in your own code. So the first problem that I want to point out is kind of a procedural problem. We wanted to make it really easy for people to get the latest version of jQuery. And if you're like a high-end developer, nowadays best practices, people say you could use a dependency manager, a system like Bower or NPM to pull down all your modules and figure out the dependencies. But a lot of people, there's no shame in just downloading the latest version and putting it in your JavaScript directory on your website and using that directly, especially if you're using a server-side content system like WordPress. So we made it really easy to do that. You could just go to one of these locations and get the latest version of jQuery. Well, some people started saying, well, I always want to run the latest version. The latest version is probably the best one, right? So what they did is they included that script tag inside their own production websites. Now, the problem with that is every time we update jQuery, you're going to magically get whatever we have just released. And you won't have tested it most of the time. When we put out betas, we usually say, please test it with your website. We'd love to have you use it. But the majority of people don't. And because of that, you're going to get a potentially bad surprise. You're going to get really bad surprise. Story behind this is that a woman was actually getting a surprise birthday gift for her husband, and she didn't quite make it out of the parking lot. I felt sorry for her. But anyway, when you use jQuery latest, you want the latest one, you got it. And so what happens, we've got a bug report here where somebody is very upset that they got the latest version with things they didn't expect. And you can, even when you want to, you can never be completely sure that the latest version you release doesn't have any problems that won't be found. So unfortunately, these people were pretty mad about it, but I have only a limited amount of sympathy for them. Don't use the latest version in production. What you want to do, get the latest version, test it locally, make sure it works on all the browsers you care about, which should be all the major browsers, and then stop there. The solution that we ended up with was, because this problem is so common now, the latest is no longer the latest. We actually have frozen the latest at version 1.11.1, and Google has done the same because they were having the same kind of problems where people were using their CDN version at /1, which says just give me the latest one that's out there. And that was causing lots of sites to fail, as even minor changes sometimes will make a difference, especially in these older websites where people are following bad practices. Don't do it. Include a specific version of jQuery. You can include it from a CDN if it makes sense. Be sure to test with it. And then when you want to upgrade, be sure to retest. I mentioned the features that jQuery 1.9 removed. This URL at the top there actually lists them all in great detail. Many of them were pretty subtle changes. The two major things that we took out that I think were important to not have people do, first is $.browser, which allows you to say, is this Internet Explorer, is this Firefox? In 2006, that was considered kind of normal practice. But if you look at today's browsers, there aren't that many differences that you can't detect with just with feature detection. So what you want to use instead is to say, does this browser have, does it have add event listener? And if it does, use it. Otherwise, if it has attach event, which probably means it's older Internet Explorer, use that. But there's no reason to say, is this Internet Explorer? Because for one thing, Internet Explorer has changed over the years. So whatever question you're asking is probably making an assumption that is no longer correct. There's a lot of websites out there that are broken for one or more browsers because they ask those kinds of questions. The other major one that we removed was live. People love live because it allows you just to kind of say, select some stuff, and whether elements are there now or might be there later, don't worry about it. Just listen for events. The problem with that is that it's very inefficient. When you listen for events at the very top of the document, it essentially means that you've got to wait until the event bubbles all the way up to the document before you can handle it. And in fact, Live was created before Apple came out with touch events. But with Apple touch events, there are circumstances where the touch events do not even bubble up to the document. So you cannot handle events consistency on an iPhone or an iPad with Live. And there's a big old list of problems that still exist with Live. And we decided that it was better to take that out because people were stumbling across these problems on a regular basis. If you want, or if you have some older code that you want to migrate up past jQuery 1.9, you can use the jQuery Migrate plugin. You just drop that in the page, and it will put out messages on the console telling you what the problem is, how to fix it, and pointing out the lines where the problem occurs. Now, if you really want to get a good foot gun, like let's say you have the entire team you want to knock out at once and destroy. You need some more firepower. I just can't imagine, I guess if you were being attacked by a gang, and you wanted to fire once, but I think they call these duckbill guns. But I just could never imagine why you would need a gun with 4 barrels. If you really want to hurt yourself, what you need to do is try to create some jank or essentially forcing layouts in the browser. And one great way to force layouts in the browser is to start changing things on a regular basis when you don't need to. When you look at what happens in a browser, in a 16 millisecond frame, potentially everything on this little flowchart needs to happen. The way you get performance is to try to avoid as many of these steps as you can on a frame. But if your JavaScript starts modifying HTML or CSS, you pretty much will end up going through this entire pipeline. And the more you do that, some people even try to do it 2 or 3 times in a single frame, which is a waste. The more you do that, the better the chance that you will actually see jank. You will see a situation where the browser stutters and stops because it can't keep up. You're asking it to do too much. So there are 2 selectors that we put into jQuery early on called visible and hidden. They seem like a pretty cool thing to do. You say, well, I want to select all the visible elements or the hidden elements and do something with them. The problem with that is you need to ask the browser to find out whether they're visible or hidden. Because especially when you think about visible, if you hide a parent, that also hides all the children, even though looking at it, you wouldn't know if the element is a hidden child or not without walking up the tree and seeing if it's hidden, or asking the browser. So that can cause a lot of these forced layouts. Because if you change some property of the page and then ask the browser what's hidden or visible, the browser has no choice but to say, oh, you've changed the page, especially if you change the CSS, I need to know whether those pages are visible or not. I mean, whether those elements are visible or not. So I came across something like this. It's a simplified example, but the console times are essentially a way for me to create the graphs that you'll see in a second. The two lines in the center there, essentially I'm changing a class on the body, so it potentially affects the entire page. And then I'm asking for the visible paragraphs to be colored blue. What that does is, hey, I think I can use my pointer. Let's see where I have that. Here, kitty, kitty. So if you look at the time there, that's using that time, console.time. And you can see it takes 30 milliseconds here to run that, the event handler that we were timing. And there's this huge recalculate style here. That's happening because we changed the style of the body tag. And so the browser really, because the next step we did was say, show us what things are visible, it didn't really have any choice but to go and recalculate style before it could even finish our code. That's a forced synchronous layout, a really bad thing. Chrome helpfully shows you this with this yellow triangle. When you start seeing yellow triangles in your timeline, that's Chrome crying out in pain, telling you that you are actually forcing the browser to do a lot more calculations than you might want to do. Sometimes that's unavoidable, but usually, quite often it is, and I'll show you what you do to avoid it here. You can also see that it appears that the guilty party is jQuery, but when you look at that, you have to remember that you are the one calling into jQuery. So if you were to trace that back, you would find that your own code is what caused jQuery to need to do that. So one solution to this is to use a class instead of the visible. I just created a class called showing, which you'd probably want to pick something semantically better than visible or hidden to indicate why the reason you're going to color them blue. But I still have a class on the body, and then I ask, okay, find me all the ones with class showing and color them blue. And look how much better we got. Now we're only at 8 milliseconds. Remember that big purple line here is gone. After we're done, because we removed a class in the body, it still needs to recalculate style, but it can do that later after the JavaScript is finished running. And you notice it takes a lot less time to do it. So, and it still has to do a repaint. It still has to basically put the bits back on the screen if anything changed. But it is a much better situation for the browser, and it gets rid of the little yellow exclamation points. So how do you avoid this? You can use visible and hidden in ways that won't cause this, but I really feel like most of the time you don't need them anyway. It's better to track visibility and hidden in your own code rather than just kind of asking the browser a bunch of questions. Also, when you go back to this code, it turns out that activated was a piece of information that didn't have anything to do with the style or structure of the page. It was a JavaScript flag that they were using classes on the body. It's not a good idea. If you have something that's strictly JavaScript related, then keep it in data attributes, keep it in jQuery's data method, or a variable somewhere in your program inside a closure. But don't stick things on the DOM unless they're related to styling or displaying something in the elements, because the DOM is not a very good database. So now I'm going to gore another ox or shoot another foot, I guess. Show and hide. Everybody loves the show and hide methods. They're so simple, they're so obvious, they're so intuitive, right? I pick an element, I say show it, pick an element, and I hide it. Well, to do that, to make sure it really shows, we change the style attribute on that element to make sure that if there's any other style sheets or things that might hide it, that it really shows it. So this is awesome. This is like, I don't know why I'm saying don't use show and hide, because there couldn't be anything that could possibly go wrong, right? Of course not. There's a whole bunch of questions that come up when people start really doing real things with show and hide. Here's one. I've got a span. I create it using jQuery's constructor. So I create a little piece of HTML that has hi in a span. And then I show it, and then I append it to the body. Well, what does it mean to show something that's not yet in the document? Well, let's just say, in this case, we'll say, well, we don't really have to do anything. We'll just assume that we don't have to add a style attribute at all because it's showing. Okay, well, what if somewhere in your CSS you have something that says something like this? It says, well, spans are by default display none. Well, in this case, we've got to put something on there to say display. We'll probably do display inline, right? Because it's a span. Spans are inline. Well, what if span is display block? And I'm not making this stuff up. I mean, you could say, oh, nobody will ever do that. People do that. And what if it's display block? Well, now, you won't know what the style is until you put it in the document and see what the cascade tells you. But if you put it into the document, then you make the browser do all of these calculations to figure out what your span's going to look like. And you'll do a forced layout, essentially. You have to do a forced layout, which is a bad thing. We already saw in the previous example that forced layouts waste the browser's time. So, you think that's the worst of it? No, there's worse. Responsive pages. So, I've got something like this. I've got something where the display of an element easily could change based on the parameters of the page. So if I show something, I forced it to show. Now when I go to some other state where the screen is smaller or I've rotated it, all of a sudden, now it's still showing. It can't ever be invisible because I forced it to show. So the result of this is for hide and show, I really think the best thing to do is pretend they are not there. Use classes and display none to decide whether you're going to show or hide elements. That allows things like responsive pages to stay responsive. It also prevents all of these edge cases that we talked about where somebody's got some elements that are inline by default or block in some other situations. And again, some responsive pages do that. They might lay things out differently based on the size of the page. So as much as show and hide are such a great verb to use, I don't think they're really a good thing. They end up being a foot gun for today's web pages, especially with responsive design. So let's look at, this is foot gun, right? This is, I mean, when I was, of course, you do the Google image search and you try to find the interesting images, but global settings. Let me show you another way you can really mess something up. Here is a really simple example. There's no way this code could go wrong. So it's making an Ajax request. It's going to request file.txt. It'll request that from the current server, whatever server the HTML page came from. And on success, we're going to alert out the contents of the file that we got. Now, that's pretty obvious. I mean, and of course, it was so obvious that we didn't even bother having an error handler because no error could possibly occur. We're just going to ignore anything that goes wrong. Okay, so there's a method called Ajax setup, and it lets you change the defaults for Ajax. And of course, there are no little firewalls between the code you write and the code that the plugin guy wrote and that crazy Joe guy who works with you who doesn't know anything about programming. You can't prevent anybody else from, unless you have some kind of death rule about Ajax setup. If somebody starts making changes in Ajax setup, those defaults apply to everybody's code. So I, in a really sadistic moment, have said every Ajax request by default is type post, and it's data type JSON, and it only gets 500 milliseconds before I give up and I declare a timeout error. So you can go back to this example. Oh boy. So now, because we said by default this is going to be a JSON request, unless this file happens to be JSON, it's going to throw an error because data will not be JSON. And when it tries to parse it, it should go to your error handler, but it can't because there's no error handler. And most likely, if you're going to get a text file from a lot of servers, they don't like post requests to something that's not like it's just a plain page. They may error out on that. I know like ASP.NET does. And the last thing was the timeout. The timeout is the most insidious one, and I have seen this in reality. The other two were probably worst case scenarios. But if you set a tight timeout and are making requests where you do not see a timeout going on, imagine you get random errors. Like every once in a while, this stops working, especially because you didn't have an error handler. And you can't figure out why. And the reason why is with a 500 millisecond timeout, when you're testing against localhost, this thing works fine. There's no problem when you're running it on your intranet and your staging server where there's no load. And then you get it out into production, and it's like half of the stuff is failing, and you can't figure out why. So that's why you never want to use Ajax setup. You can't tell, as we saw from the call point, what the code is really doing. And it's extremely difficult if you want to have multiple modules that you didn't write working with code that you did write if you start using Ajax setup. Because even if you say, I know what I'm doing, and you use Ajax setup, there will be some plugin down in the guts of your system that you use that is like an autocomplete plugin using Ajax, and you'll mess it up. So there's a really simple way you can avoid this. Just wrap your own, create your own function that wraps Ajax and sets whatever options you want before it makes a request. So it's not really very hard to fix this problem. Global settings are not the solution. Some type of custom function to make whatever request you want is a better approach. The other thing that jQuery is well known for is its ability pretty much to try to make sense of whatever you give it. And that's kind of like good news and bad news, right? So we see that you can pass just about anything to a jQuery constructor. This is the ready. This actually, when you call it with a function, it will run that when the document's ready. Call it with an element, it wraps that element. Call it with an array of elements, it wraps that array of elements together. You can call it with a plain object. That's not really very common, but people do, and like trigger events on it. And you can call it with a single HTML element, string, and then some attributes that you want to set on that element. You can call it with a selector, and as we saw from some of the examples before, you can call it with HTML to create new elements that probably eventually you'll inject into the document. So because it can take anything, when you see a piece of code like that says selector append to body, you're probably thinking that you're taking something out of the document and then putting it up at the level of the body. But it turns out that it can be anything. Just because the word selector shows up there doesn't mean it's a selector. Because remember, it could be a function. You could be setting a ready handler with this. It would be kind of crazy to do that, but you could be. And I show an example here. This is like a danger. If you start accepting input, if you let the user or the URL provide a selector and that's not vetted, that you're not exactly sure where it came from, that selector could be script. And then you append it to the body and it executes. So you don't want to do that. But this is, even though it's a foot gun, it's not a bug because the whole idea of jQuery is to let you manipulate the document. So the fact that you can insert HTML with jQuery is a feature and not a bug. If you just want to set literal text, you can use text. That will create that will not try to execute or interpret any HTML there. If there are angle brackets, it will set them as ampersand LT and GT to prevent any interpretation as HTML. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to be very careful with URL data in particular, because anything that comes from an untrusted source can be massaged by an attacker. I'd also add cookies to this. Cookies are no big secret. It's easy from a browser standpoint to set cookies, and those can be used to attack. So, if you don't want your site to have cross-site scripting holes, don't use jQuery with untrusted input and then pass it to, say, the jQuery constructor, or insert HTML from sources you're not familiar with. These next footguns are really things that I think will improve your code, but most of the time there's nothing particularly wrong with doing it the way I've shown. I just think it's really good for people to write the clearest possible code, and sometimes jQuery is not the clearest possible code. You want to be able to use the native methods first. So in this case, I have something where I have a button called toggle checkboxes, and for each checkbox that I have, which happens to be have a class CB, I'm going to set the check property to the opposite of whatever the check property was on that checkbox before. So it's got a lot of parentheses and dollar signs and quotes that say checked, and it's a long line. So this does the same thing, and I'll just toggle back and forth quickly. You can see how much simpler the code is. It turns out that ever since DOM0, which is probably like Netscape days in the 1990s, it's been possible to use the check property on a checkbox. And that is 100% fully compatible all the way back into history. So you don't have to worry about it being something to avoid because jQuery is trying to smooth it out for you. And that's a great way to do it. I mean, you use jQuery when it helps you, and avoid jQuery when it makes things uglier. And it turns out that this, in most cases, how many times are you clicking the toggle checkbox button? But this is probably 200 times slower. It runs 200 times more instructions to do this than it does to do this, at least in that one line there. So although efficiency isn't the primary issue here, it's more of a beauty thing. When you're doing it a lot, if you're in a situation where you're going directly and you're running this lots of times, then you would definitely want to use the native methods. And here's kind of a little cheat sheet showing you, instead of using the jQuery approach, directly use this. I'm assuming here that the this is a DOM element. Usually it's going to be a DOM element either in an each, as we saw that example, or in a event handler, because by default the event handler's this property is the element that was where the event's being handled. So you can see it gets a lot prettier, fewer dollar signs and parentheses and quotation marks, and 100, 200 times faster as well. jQuery also added custom selectors. We saw a couple of them earlier, visible and hidden. Those custom selectors are actually interpreted by a JavaScript selector engine called Sizzle, which is really fast and well written. It is not quite as fast, though, as the query selector all method, which is the one that's provided by the browser. It turns out, actually, you can go back and see an article written by John Resig in 2000 well, it's whenever Query Selector All came out. If you go to ejon.org, you will see John Resig explaining how they got Query Selector All wrong. And unfortunately, this was a case where we could have worked with the standards groups to make sure they built something the users needed, the web developers needed. They built something that kind of has some assumptions that are not the assumption most of web developers make. So even when Query Selector All is used by Sizzle, it needs to wrap up the results and fix a few things. In the case of these custom selectors, they can get slow. We saw visible and hidden could be slow. These selectors, you might as well use the real W3C selectors because they're always going to be fast, and Query Selector All can process them immediately. And here's a few of them. You can see we have some shortcuts called like : checkbox, : radio. Colon radio is the same as input type equal radio. That's the standard way to say it. That's if you use query selector all, that would be the way you would need to say it for it to be understood. There's also some interesting ones like button in jQuery means either a button element or an input type equal button. Header, which now that there's a header element, it's even more confusing because colon header really means H1 through H5. First and last are a little different. I showed that first child could be used to replace first, but that would only be in the case where all the elements in the collection are from the same parent. If you have elements in a collection from many different parents, you would want to use the first method on a jQuery chain to get the first out of each, or get the first one out of the collection. But do be careful about native methods. I showed you a few safe to do things that you can do with selectors. Here's ones that can mess you up. If you want to use this class name add to add something to the class name, that's not supported in IE8 or Android 2.x. Whereas jQuery's add class works everywhere. And if you just want to set the class name, you can just assign to class name rather than adding to the class name. But that's, I think, especially when you're working in large projects, it's a risk to just manually assign the class name because you may clobber somebody else's work. So that's pretty much it. I think we have about 7 minutes for questions, which pretty much amazes me because this is the first time I've done this particular talk, and normally I either run real long or real short. So I've got enough time to answer some questions.
Hi. I'd like to know about the jQuery Foundation. How is it funded?
The question was about the jQuery Foundation. The jQuery Foundation is funded by memberships and donations. So you can donate money through our website as an individual. You can become an individual member, and you'll get a T-shirt and a bag and some other cool swag. Or large organizations have joined the foundation. Companies like IBM, Microsoft, Adobe, and they pay for memberships as well.
How much is an individual membership?
An individual membership is $400. If you want to make a donation of a smaller amount, or also we sell T-shirts, but people sometimes say, "Oh, I'll take the T-shirt," and you'll say, "Okay, that's $25." You say, "$25 for a T-shirt?" It's like, well, we have to make our money somewhere. We can't give away T-shirts. Well, some people can, but and we do occasionally when we have our own conferences. So, but yeah, thanks for the question. The jQuery Foundation is funded mostly by memberships, and the companies that join are interested in making sure that, especially in the case of large companies that develop software, that their voice is heard in the standards organizations, because most of the people in the W3C are companies that develop browsers, so they are not the consumers of that technology, they're the producers.
So what happened with Query Selector All?
That was from, I think Query Selector All was started in about 2004, and at that point, there wasn't a lot of attention being paid to standards. So it slipped by, and nobody in the developer community really got a chance. Everybody kind of thought about it in general warm, fuzzy terms, but once they started using it, they realized there were some issues with the way it was implemented.
So the jQuery Foundation?
That's right. jQuery Foundation has only been around since 2011. So, in the back. Oh, it's Kyle.
Ajax setup?
Yeah.
You said best practice is the way to use the individual instead. You can't stop anybody else. Would it make sense if what is there to for you to call and get ready to make your own Ajax call? Say, I want to reset the options just for this call. Instead of listing out every one of the 50 or 60 that are there, makes a call with an object.
Yeah, so the question was, with Ajax setup, is there a way just to, or could we create a way to reset all the Ajax options? Because the only other way to protect yourself is to explicitly say every option. At the moment, there is not a way to do that. one of the things that we're working on now is actually a new API, because if you look at Ajax, it's definitely the most complex API in jQuery. It has many, many options. So we don't currently have a way, and in fact, we use a set of defaults that we always start with, which are the ones that people expect, like get being the default. So there probably is some way that we could take that set of defaults and store them away somewhere, and then you could pass in a flag saying pure, true, or something like that.
Or you could just simply make that object default available as a public property to access.
Well, if you did that, it's also writable. somebody would probably write it, but yeah, you could. There's probably some solution there. One of the things that we are doing is coming up with actually a much sleeker Ajax, actually an XHR specific API to make it so that it's much simpler to make simple Ajax requests, and also be able to get better access to all the new features like XHR2 features. So you'll probably be seeing something about that in the next month or two. Other questions? Come on, we have 3 minutes. I hope you all learned something.
Where's the foundation located?
The foundation doesn't actually have any offices. That's one of the ways we save money. So we're a virtual organization. The people who are the board members of the foundation are not compensated and work for various places in the industry, or they're independent consultants. And we have a mailing address where you can send things, but there's actually no there's no offices. Employed by the foundation, there's only one employee, and that's our executive director, Chris Borchers. We have a few contractors that do some software development. There's about 4 of those. Most of them are part-time. And everybody else is just volunteers, so they're companies. Some of them are the member companies. Their companies help by providing people who triage pull requests or write code or write documentation. Any other questions? I can make them available. I'll tweet out. I'll put them on SlideShare and tweet out a link to you. And if FITC has a website or something, I can make it available there as well. That I didn't check to see what the situation is. You'll definitely get them. All right. Well, thank you very much.